David Grush, in his testimony, said that there is an active disinformation campaign being waged against the populace of the United States. Like Elon Musk is going to be an immortal, technological, oligarchical overlord. But we can actually structure a world that looks more like Star Trek, or we head down the road of dystopia.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Watch Mojo and the Unveiled podcast. I'm your host, Rob, and today's guest is Dr. Stephen Brown. He is a teaching professor of philosophy at Ohio State University, and he is also the director of the Visible College, which is a volunteer group of academics who are conducting and promoting serious research on UAPs and related topics. Thanks for joining us today, Stephen. It's great to speak with you.
It's great to meet you. Thank you.
So, as a professor of philosophy, what is it that got you interested in UAPs in the first place? I saw on your website that you relatively recently became interested in this topic. So what sparked your interest?
So my personal academic background in philosophy has mostly been in the area of the philosophy of religion, and to some extent also ethics. Those are the things that I've worked on most. I was completely ignoring everything to do with UAPs and aliens and the paranormal in general up until the summer of 2023. There was an article published in an online newspaper called The Debrief, where there was an interview between, there was a video also by Russ Coldhart, but this guy named David Grush, who was an intelligence officer, who was making some very extraordinary claims. In a nutshell, that the United States government has a secret UFO recovery program and has in its possession multiple craft of non-human origin and bodies of pilots of those craft, what David Grush calls non-human biologics. And Grush was fact-checked as far as like checking to make sure he was who he said he was, that he had the kind of clearances and access to classified information that he said that he did. All those checks look good. He reported through a whistleblower process to the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community. He's spoken to House Intelligence Committee, Senate Intelligence Committee. All of those people are taking him very seriously. So when that happened, I kind of freaked out, honestly, realizing that I had been ignoring something which seems to be extremely important. And so I kind of went into a frantic, manic, sleepless series of months where I spent all hours of the day and night talking to ChatGPT and reading books and articles and watching YouTube videos and trying to get up to speed on what everybody had been saying in this space. And as everybody like me knows, once you turn your attention to this, you realize there is a huge amount of information here. That there is, sometimes people ask, how could something be kept a secret this long? It's never been a secret. There have been people leaking this, talking about this since at least the 1940s, late 1940s, early 1950s. And yeah, it's very perplexing. It's very confusing. Those of us who take this seriously, I think none of us claim to understand exactly what's going on. It's a very perplexing set of data that we're trying to account for. Which is why I think on the website we talk about like we're really just committed to one idea, which is that there's something worth paying attention to here. It's worthy of scholarly inquiry. But myself and the people who I work with and talk to, none of us claim to have like the view about what's going on, and we're not trying to like convince everybody of exactly what the truth is. We all know that we're operating with a sparsity of data here, but the data does seem to indicate that some very substantially important and really powerfully weird things are true.
It's good to see an academic such as yourself and your peers having more of an interest in this, but there does still seem to be somewhat of a stigma surrounding the UAP topic in academic circles. And I can point to a few high-profile, scientific people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, for example, and others who seem to, still talk down about this and kind of, not really give it the time of day that it deserves. Why do you think that is? Why is there such resistance to look into this with a little more depth?
Yeah, good. I want to address that, but I do want to just note quickly that there are some very, very high-powered scientists who are paying attention to this. Avi Loeb at Harvard, Michio Kaku, Gary Nolan, like world-class scientists who actually are paying attention to this. So we need to keep that in mind also. I
Mhm.
agree with you. There is a stigma. It is a minority position right now, but there are some very, very, very serious academic people who are taking it very seriously. So that being said, why are we where we are? We're on the front end of a really important paradigm shift. So, there's a philosopher of science named Thomas Kuhn who wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which was in many ways the beginnings of modern philosophy of science. And he talks about this idea of a paradigm, right? So what happens is the scientific community builds a consensus, and we put together a whole toolkit of ideas and experiments and data and things that are kind of the accepted ones. And then we elaborate on that and get into a lot of detail. And this is actually very, very healthy for a scientific community. We can't have all of the questions in the air all the time, right? Like we have to have some framework to work in, and that allows us to dive deep, right? But sometimes what happens is we realize that there's important gaps in the paradigm. So it's easy to look back on history and see these things. So go back in time to the Copernican revolution, right? Once upon a time, every smart person thought that the Earth was at the center of the universe because it looks that way, right? You wake up in the morning and you look and you watch the sun move through the sky. And so, of course, that's going to be the first view that we develop. And it turns out that that view is quite powerful. And, when I talk to my students about philosophy of science and epistemology, the study of knowledge, I'll often use this as an example case. There's actually nothing wrong with geocentrism mathematically. Like you can actually still construct a geocentric model that will predict all the data. It's just insanely complicated, and it's just much easier and simpler and more elegant to switch over to a heliocentric model with the sun at the middle, right? That's what Copernicus taught us. And but that idea was very unpopular at first. And in fact, the people who advocated for that idea, Galileo especially, got in trouble for it. And now we look back on those people and we think of them as our intellectual heroes. They were trailblazers, right? Like they saw the truth and they went with it even when it was unpopular. That's, I believe, where we are right now. We're in kind of coming out of the Galileo era, right? Like up until recently, everybody that talked about this was mocked and not taken very seriously. And largely over the last, I don't know, 5 or 6 years, but in particular over the past 2 or 3 years, there's been an acceleration of interest. And David Grush, I think, will, be seen historically as one of the pivotal moments. But also Lou Elizondo, who was the guy who worked for this program internal to the Department of Defense called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, ATIP. He was the one who worked with Christopher Mellon to get those very famous, kind of grainy videos from the Navy pilots released to the public. That they got the New York Times articles published in 2017, right? That was probably the really big turning point, but David Grush is kind of putting gas on that. So yeah, what's happening is there's this stigma in place, and when there's a stigma in place, it kind of self-reinforces. So there's actually a few reasons why this is so recalcitrant, why it's so difficult to change people's minds. And in a nutshell, it's because we don't really want it to be true. So like our like core psychology turns away from it. This is sort of like, it's very similar to the psychology of grief, right? If somebody dies, like the first stage is denial. You just like can't even face it. And it's sort of like that. In a nutshell, the kind of worldview of Western civilization is a disjunction. You're either like a Neil deGrasse Tyson style atheist materialist person, or you subscribe to one of the Abrahamic traditions, statistically speaking, Christianity, but of course, Judaism and Islam also incredibly important. So you're kind of supposed to think that either nothing weird and paranormal happens at all, it's all a hoax or a misunderstanding or a misrepresentation or something. That's your kind of Neil deGrasse Tyson view, debunker kind of view.
Mhm.
And or you believe that there are some kinds of supernatural, paranormal things, weird things that happen, but we kind of understand how it works, and you have to understand it in this one particular way. And if it kind of breaks out of that mold, then you should ignore it because it's probably bad. Um, and so yeah, we've kind of lived like that's been the scope of our intellectual diversity, right? Like the debate has been between essentially Abrahamic monotheism and atheistic materialism. I mean, that's certainly where I spent all of my adult life up until a couple of years ago, studying the philosophy of religion, looking for arguments, about arguments about God and miracles and souls and stuff like that. That's what I was interested in. I'm still interested in it. It's just that my interests have now gotten a lot larger because it seems like when we do that, when we only pay attention to those possibilities, there's a whole range of things that do happen, happen quite regularly, happen to a lot of people that aren't supposed to happen. And so we kind of pretend that they don't. I'll recommend for people who want to do a deep dive here. There's a really excellent book by a philosopher at Rice University named Jeffrey Kripal. It's called How to Think Impossibly. I would strongly recommend reading that. I think that's kind of the best book that exists right now of like really academic rigor that's trying to think seriously about all of the weird stuff that's going on and really kind of facing the costs about what it's going to take for us to revise how we think about the world to actually account for all of this stuff.
So tell me a little bit about the Visible College. What is your mission with this organization?
The Visible College is a group of academics and scholars. We like to call ourselves scholars. Most of us have PhDs and are working in some kind of an academic context, or have left academia for one reason or another. But we also recognize, right, anybody who has a PhD knows that having a PhD is more about endurance than intelligence. So there's some very, very intelligent, scholarly people who don't have PhDs, who don't fall kind of under the ordinary scope of academics. So we have several of those people also. But people who have that kind of academic scholarly rigor, who have at some point started taking these issues seriously and have been bringing to bear their training, their skills to think critically and carefully, but also very open-mindedly about these things. And that's a peculiar experience to go through. It's very, very disruptive. We have a name for this experience. It's called ontological shock, right? Ontological meaning having to do with the nature of being, the nature of reality. And so going into ontological shock means realizing that your ontology, your view about what the world is made up of, how the world works, is wildly wrong. And so you kind of go through this process where you have to process all of that, right? Like I sometimes talk about like if this is normal, then you start out as normal, and then there's some piece of data that breaks that for you. And then you start to realize, well, if that's true, then this is true, and if that's true, then this is true. And then you get really, really far away and you start encountering like more and more bizarre options that you can't take seriously, and you like want to go back to being normal. So you try to be normal again, but then there's that one weird thing that just won't go away, right? And it just, for me, it was David Grush. And yeah, so there's a lot of us who've gone through this experience. And in a way, the Visible College is almost like a support group. It's just an opportunity for people with a certain kind of mindset to be able to talk to each other and be like, so this is really like pretty serious, right? Like this isn't actually crazy, as strange as it is. And we all go, yeah, no, it's really serious. It's something here. Yeah, and yeah, it's crazy. And we all feel crazy together. So it's kind of that, but we're also trying to do a couple of other things. We're trying to think seriously about this impending sort of pseudo hypothetical event that we call disclosure with a big D, right? Like disclosure with a big D is whenever enough information gets out to the public of sufficient seriousness and credibility that everybody really has to face it all at once. And when that happens, we will have a paradigm shift, right? We were talking about Kuhn's concept of paradigms. Paradigms don't change in a linear manner, right? There's like a pressure that builds up and then they break. And when they break quickly. So over the course of months and years, people will have to, you know, deal with ontological shock at scale, like at planetary scale. And that is very likely to have a whole range of undesirable consequences. And if you watch a TV show like The Three Body Problem, and right, like everybody comes to realize at once that there's something going on, and some very, very bad things happen, right? People commit suicide, for instance. I strongly suggest that if you are feeling that way, you seek professional help because suicide is not the answer. And on the other side of ontological shock is a very interesting worldview that you should spend some time with. But I am worried about people having to face the degree of ontological shock that they do at the scale that it seems like it might happen. So we've been trying to think about ways that disclosure might have potentially negative impacts and potentially positive impacts, and try to get ahead of this as much as we can so that there's at least some people who have communication, education, kinds of skills, professional and scholarly skills, who have already thought about this, so that when the big wave comes, there's some people like you who can call up people like me and say, "So, Steve, what's going on, and how do we deal with this?" And then I can say, "Well, here's some thoughts that people like me and my community of folk have been thinking about for a while." We are connected to some organizations that are working in the political sphere. We have good relationships with the UAP caucus and UAP Disclosure Fund here in the United States. We have good relationships with the Soul Foundation, who's also doing some policy work, the New Paradigm Institute. There's a whole handful of organizations that are kind of trying to be ahead of this and push for disclosure, but also do some planning and thought about what might happen on the other side of disclosure. I think of ourselves more in the second camp than the first camp. I think disclosure is inevitable at this point, and I'm actually kind of glad that it hasn't happened yet. Because I don't think we're really ready for it, and I don't think we'll ever be ready for it. It's like childbirth, right? Like you're never ready for your first kid, but you can at least read a couple of books and and try to paint the kid's room and to buy a crib and stuff before the kid gets there. But when it happens, you will have many sleepless nights and you'll freak out, and you'll try to get help from your friends. We are trying to be your friends when you go through ontological shock.
I'm sure that it will be more of a challenge for some people and less of a challenge for other people, but by and large, how prepared do you think society is for this paradigm shift? And do you think that in the West, due to our more materialist, consumerist behavior and lifestyles, that this is a disadvantage for us, that we might be more susceptible to a very rude awakening, like when this does become an inevitable reality that everybody must face?
It's a hard question to answer. In some ways, I think we are relatively well prepared. I think, and I really don't know what to make of this, but like about the same time that the modern wave of UFO phenomenon begins, which is like the 30s and 40s, roughly around that time is when we really start to see science fiction take off. And so like we actually have over the past 100 years or so been spending a lot of time in the fiction space, exploring these big ideas and thinking about them, right? Like I'm a big Star Wars nerd, and like
Mm-hmm.
I think about that's kind of been my childhood. Well, basically everybody walking the planet today is, look, real talk, about a generation out from Roswell. So when Roswell happened in 47, which I believe is 100% correct, like the original press release by Major Marcel saying, "Hey, we picked up a flying saucer." That really happened, and then they had to change their story, and they're like, "Never mind, it's a weather balloon," and right, that's the beginning of the cover-up. So like around 1947, we are now about one human lifetime away from that. So everybody dealing with this right now is more or less aware that something weird might be happening. We've explored it in fiction. We've explored it as something to make fun of, right? We have jokes about alien abductions and things like that, right? So everyone's kind of aware of it, but most people aren't really paying attention. So in some ways, we're prepared. And I do think that, I mean, a lot of people already believe this. A lot of people kind of want it to be true, right? Like it could be fun, it could be exciting depending on the details. Admittedly, it could be somewhat frightening depending on the details. And like I said before, we do not know the details right now. So it's very puzzling what's going on. But are we less prepared than other societies? Oh, yeah, way less prepared, right? So, like, if you kind of tick through the worldview boxes, right? Like, Hinduism, piece of cake. They've been believing in beings of all kinds that interact with humans in all kinds of ways and strange objects in the sky. Like, they've believed this for thousands of years. Like, they're going to be fine. Buddhists, basically the same way, right? Almost all of the like smaller indigenous traditions, they're fine. Like they all believe that there are sky people and sky nations, and they have relationships with them of various kinds. And like no doubt the details will be important and people will have to adjust, right? But the two worldviews that I mentioned a moment ago, I think are the ones that are going to have the hardest. I think the Westerners are going to have the hardest time, right? Neil deGrasse Tyson's going to have a weird day when an alien shows up in his bedroom and says, "Hey, Neil, buddy, turns out we're real and you were wrong," right? Man, I would love to be a fly on the wall when a gray appears in Neil's room and like makes him confront that. I don't know, Neil. I hope you have a lovely time when this happens. It's going to be fun. I'm also concerned personally. I'm quite concerned about possible theological implications and ways in which that might be disruptive to people about beliefs that are quite near and dear to them. And like I said earlier about the kind of trauma of ontological shock, like I hope that everyone will be patient and take care of themselves and be embedded in communities who can go through this together because I don't think at the end of the day this is bad news. It might require that we adjust some things. But as a person who teaches Asian philosophies every semester, I just want to remind people, right? Like the Hindus have been thinking this way for thousands of years. The Buddhists have been thinking about this way for thousands of years. The indigenous people have been thinking this way for thousands of years, and they're fine. So, like, if there's something embedded in your worldview that's uncomfortable, it's okay. Sit with your discomfort, listen to some people who are less uncomfortable, and you'll be okay. There's some stuff on the other side that's really fascinating and beautiful and interesting that you've just been ignoring, and that's okay. You'll get over it.
Some people would argue that disclosure has already happened, or perhaps phase one of disclosure, with the acknowledgement from governments about UAPs in the sky, claiming they don't know what they are, what the origin is, and now a new term has entered the kind of public, discourse, which is NHI, non-human intelligence. This is the supposed extra layer to peel back once you get over the UAPs existing, non-human intelligence possibly being behind them. Let's talk about that a little bit. What are your views on that? And if the origins of these are non-human, as some claim, what could some possible motivations be for their behaviors?
Yeah, good. So, if we look back in history from like 100 years from now, when we ask when did disclosure happen, I actually do suspect it will be the 2017 New York Times articles that are the ones that kind of are stated to be the beginning of disclosure. And you're absolutely right. Like, there's some very notable admissions by public figures. One of my favorite is the interview that was done on James Corden with Barack Obama, where I forget his name, but one of the people in the band is asking Obama about aliens. And he gets really wiggly and he says something like, well, there's things about the aliens that I can't tell you, but I can tell you that there do seem to be objects in the sky that behave very strangely, and we don't know what they are, right? Now that's a lie. Like that's it's the official lie that's been in place since at least like the 1950s, right? Like there was a press briefing in 1952 where it's right after this very peculiar wave of UFOs that happens in the summer of 1952, including a very striking series of events in Washington, D.C., where there are formations of glowing craft that are flying over the White House and the Capitol that are seen on radar and by multiple pilots and ground observers. Like it's a very striking series of cases. In fact, it's so striking that if you go and look for, I gave you the link so you can put some images up here at some point. There's a Navy.mil, so an official Navy history website called U2's UFOs and Project Blue Book. And on there is a photograph taken by a Coast Guard photographer in the summer of 1952 of four glowing objects flying in formation. And this is a public image, and it's one that they don't want you paying attention to. And David Grush in his testimony said that there is an active disinformation campaign being waged against the populace of the United States. And I can prove it to you. It's right on that webpage. So here's a photograph they don't want you paying attention to. So what they've done is they've wrapped it with a header that says U2's UFOs and Project Blue Book. And then the first paragraph is all about how high altitude testing of the U2 soon led to an unexpected side effect. Now, that's naturally going to make your mind go, oh, okay, I shouldn't, don't worry about it. Whenever people saw these things, they were actually just seeing these spy planes and misperceiving them as flying saucers. Okay, well, just look at that picture and then go look at a picture of a U2. Those are not U2s. U2s are planes with wings. They don't look like glowing shapes. They didn't have four of them at a time flying in a V formation because, my friends, the U2 project wasn't even proposed until September of 1952. There were no U2s in the summer of 1952. This is literally the US government carrying out a misinformation campaign, a disinformation campaign on the US population today on their own website right now. You can go look at it. Um, right, like, has disclosure already happened? Yeah, probably. We know that this is true. This rhetoric has been in place since the 50s, which basically says, yeah, there's a bunch of weird stuff out there. Most of it we know what it is. There's a few things we're not sure what they are. Don't worry about it too much. That's what they've been saying for like 80 years now, right? And yeah, it's a lie. They know a lot more than they're putting on, and I expect that Obama knows it's a lie. I expect that Trump knows it's a lie. Trump has said on several occasions now that he's been briefed by Air Force pilots who have encountered these things. Right? There's now in the congressional testimony over the last couple of years, House Oversight, Senate. There's now multiple people who have, lots of people who have articulated that there is something really strange and real going on, including there's this organization called the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, which recently had a leadership change. And they were continuing on the same rhetoric that we've seen since the 50s. There's lots of cases, most of them are normal, there's a few weird ones. Don't worry about it. But for the first time at this hearing in November 19th, 2024, before the Senate, Senator Gillibrand ran this. The new Aero director actually described two of the truly anomalous cases. Um, One was a large orange orb floating several hundred feet above the ground. They get closer to it, and there's a blacker than black craft the size of a Prius that tilts up at a 45-degree angle and then shoots off the ground. All right. That's really weird. The other case that he describes is a large metallic cylinder about the size of a commercial airliner. It hangs out motionless for 15 to 20 seconds and then it disappears, right? Like those cases are real and they've been happening since at least the 1940s and the government knows about them and they're just not telling you about them because they don't want you paying attention. I Okay, so did you ask me why they don't want you? I forget. I blathered for a long time there.
No, but that's a great question. Why don't they want us to know about this?
I strongly believe that there is a wisdom to the policy. There's my colleague here at Ohio State. His name is Alex Wendt. He gave a really lovely talk at the Soul Foundation, SOL Foundation. You should all go watch all of their YouTube videos. They're fantastic. But particular, watch this one by Alex Wendt. And he talks about kind of the political implications of the reality of UFOs. And in particular, what it means is that the US government would need to admit that there are objects in our airspace, in our very sensitive airspace, including over our nuclear facilities and our military facilities and the White House and the Capitol. And then they either don't know who they are, or they do, and they don't want to tell you. But the most importantly is they can't stop them. They're not in control. And if a government admits that they're not in control of their own airspace, then you don't have a government, right? And if you don't have a government, then you have chaos and you have anarchy. And as much as some of my academic colleagues like to romanticize about an anarchic world, right? Like actual anarchy, people get killed. The poor and the powerless are the ones who suffer in anarchies, right? So it's actually a good idea to not just say, "Hey guys, we don't have control over our airspace," because that's an incredibly disruptive thing to admit. And I expect that this is actually not just I expect. I know this is what's going on in DC, right? Like there are people who know that this secret has to come out, and nobody really knows how. Right? Everybody realizes that when it comes out, it will cause this massive wave of ontological shock. Nobody wants that to happen. It's one of those like, when you tell a lie for a long time and eventually it has to come out, it just gets harder and harder and harder to tell the truth. And because that you're going to have to admit that you've been covering up something really important for now at least 80 years. And yeah, you can understand why they don't want to do that.
When the government officials frame UAPs as a potential threat, so Lou Elizondo is an example of somebody who has said this. Do you consider that to be a sort of fear mongering on their part, or what's your interpretation of that? Because my view personally is that if we have been viewing these things in our skies for decades and decades, like up to almost a century at this point, and there haven't been any obvious hostile actions against us on a large scale, why would we be considering these things to be a potential threat?
It's a great question, and it's not straightforward to answer. Let me just say a couple of things about Lou Elizondo. I trust Lou Elizondo in the sense that I believe that everything he is saying is true. I believe that he is a sincere patriot of the United States. He's trying to do his best to help the public understand a secret that he believes needs to be put into the public. He's doing this at great personal cost and risk to himself. So like I think Elizondo is a hero. And I think he's a great guy. I've been able to interact with him just a little bit, and he's been very helpful in trying to answer some of my questions within his constraints. But I mean, just to be clear, sometimes people like get complainy about these whistleblowers, like, why don't they just tell us what's going on? And it's because they will literally be killed if they do that. And I know that for a fact. I have spoken to someone who was in a SCIF, one of these secure compartmentalized intelligence facilities where you have to be these like, bug-proof rooms where you're allowed to talk about this super secure stuff. I know a person who was in one of these SCIFs when Congress was being briefed about classified information. I was not told any classified information, right? I know no classified information. Um, but this person in an interview context was talking about something and came a little too close to something they weren't supposed to talk about. That person got a call from the White House and they said, "Hey, you're aware that, you're susceptible to this clause because you signed this agreement." And that person said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" And they said, "Lethal force is authorized." So basically, like, if you say what you're not supposed to say, we will literally kill you. And at this point, we have good reason to believe that US citizens have been killed by the US government for leaking information that they weren't supposed to leak. So, hey, everybody, be nice to our whistleblower friends who are operating under their classification agreements. Their life is literally at stake. And if you look at the kinds of um, uh, contracts that our intelligence officers have to sign, even if they don't get killed, they can be incarcerated without due process forever. It's part of having the classification agreements that they have. So, like, please respect our whistleblowers with their classification agreements and what they can and cannot say. Sorry, I'm just blathering again. You had a really good question, and I was trying to sneak up on it, but I forget what it was again.
I think I was asking about whether we should consider the warnings about threats to be fear mongering, and if there's like another motive behind that.
Thank you. I wanted to say that about Lou for a lot of reasons. And one is because Lou has access to information that I don't have, like a lot of information that I don't have, right? And David Grush has information to a lot of access to a lot of information that I don't have. We know for a fact that Grush spent 4 years and interviewed 40 people, right? Elizondo has been spending longer than that and has more direct access to the information, right? Elizondo has said, and I believe that he has seen high resolution photograph, videos, data, etc. of these things, which is incontrovertible. If you could see it, you would know, right? So I don't know what Lou knows. And it might be that Lou knows about some things that are genuinely frightening, right? That being said, I do believe that the general pattern of the UFO, UAP, NHI, alien phenomena is one which looks a lot like a Star Trek style prime directive is in play, right? So in Star Trek, there's this general policy that when a highly advanced, more powerful technological kind of civilization comes into contact with a less powerful civilization, that the default policy is one of non-interference, because if you interfere, then it's, what happens is a whole lot of bad things will happen, right? That essentially the less powerful group will cede power to the more powerful group, even if the more powerful group doesn't want it, right? Like they will essentially kind of end up in this really unhealthy power differential relationship where they just become dependent and they just, kind of concede everything to the more powerful, more knowledgeable beings. And if you think, well, that's actually not what we want. We want them to grow up and be independent and make their own decisions for themselves and all that kind of stuff. Then you need to kind of leave them alone. And it looks like that's what's going on. They're not entirely leaving us alone, right? I think you asked me about these three archetypes that I
Yeah.
discuss in my Prime Directive video. Yeah, so I talk about like there's kind of three ways that things could be. There could be these kind of observer beings who are not interfering, or there's kind of interfering beings who are just always helping, or interferer beings that are always exploiting. Those are kind of three archetypes. And it looks pretty clear that we don't have any of those archetypes. They're not pure observers because they fly over the White House in formations in the 50s, right? They show up to 30 school children in at the aerial school in Africa, right? That they've been around. We all know they're around. We just don't really pay attention to it and we joke about it, right? But like that, we all know that there's something that's at least in the air. Um, and they're not exploiters in the strong sense. Like we're not just under control of the galactic empire, and they're not just like, strip mining planet Earth and enslaving all of us. That's not happening. We're also not being helped with much, right? Like we're headed right into this disastrous, not headed, we're like, well through the middle of this disastrous environmental crisis. They haven't seemed to do much about that. We went through this really horrible set of world wars in which millions and millions of people were killed, sometimes very intentionally. And they didn't seem to do anything about it. They allowed the United States to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they didn't do anything about it, right? So they're hands off-ish, but they do seem to be doing some things. And so, yeah, I think what we're looking at is a kind of Star Trek style prime directive. And so I don't think we should be terrified, right? Like the really terrifying scenarios, it seems we can rule out. Like they're not here to just strip mine Earth and enslave us all. If they wanted to do that, they could easily have done it already. So now, these things might get complicated. Like for all we know, there's many different types of NHI. Let's talk about that. And some of them might be nice, and some of them might be mean, and some of them might be so different from us that we can't even understand at all how they behave and how they think, right? They could be, who knows, right? This is why the terminology has been changed from talking about aliens to talking about NHI. So there's actually problems with using the term NHI also, which I'll mention in a moment. But alien gives a very specific idea in a kind of modern linguistic context, right? Alien means gray alien, big head, black eyes in a spaceship from someplace else, right? The reason we're talking about NHI is because there's a whole range of related phenomena which don't seem to look like that, and we don't really understand what it means. So, like, if you pay close attention to what Lou Elizondo, David Grush, and friends talk about, that they'll often say things like, maybe it's aliens, maybe it's interdimensional beings, and maybe it's time travelers. That's an option that people are considering. But let's just take the kind of interdimensional being idea seriously. Um, do a little bit of philosophy of science here. What is a dimension? A dimension is essentially a variable that you need in your equation to track all of the different dimensions of variation, right? So, to say that, well, we have our ordinary XYZ space, we have our ordinary T of time, we have all the things that we kind of know about, momentum and whatever, all that kind of, quantum stuff that we need, right? There's a certain number of variables you need to do all of that. And it might mean that we need some more variables. It might be that there's other aspects of reality, other dimensions of reality that we could imagine something like being in one place and then disappearing. And it's actually disappearing because it's traveling through some kind of another dimensional space, right? Like, you've kind of the flatland style fictions, or go play around with five-dimensional chess and stuff like that. Like, there's various, visualizations and things that can help you imagine what it might be like to exist in a fifth dimension or beyond that. And some of the things we're observing do actually look like they're acting that way. So it might be that we're dealing with things that are not ordinary time-space beings that we're used to, like me and you. Um, but other kinds of things, which of course quite naturally leads us to all of the spiritual conversations about consciousness and spirituality, and how do these beings relate to the angels, the jinn, the demons, the various kinds of beings that are encountered in our mythologies around the world and our religions around the world. How are they related to those? How many kinds of things are there exactly? And so we don't really understand even what the range of options are, which is why we use this term NHI, right? Like, some of them be things that evolved on another planet and got on a spaceship and traveled either slower or faster than the speed of light. Yes, there's been plenty of time for that to happen. This is the whole point of the Fermi paradox. You go through how many stars and how many planets and how old they are, and it's surprising that we haven't made contact. That's the point of the paradox, right? And yeah, so people like me are like, what are you talking about, Fermi? We have made contact. It's all over the place. Like, every single group of people who's ever walked the planet has said they encountered sky people in one kind or another, who taught them metallurgy and taught them agriculture and taught them mathematics and astronomy. And like, every single group of people ever has said that we've made contact. And yeah, so anyways, that's the kind of there is no Fermi paradox. We have made contact. It's not surprising. There are other planets, but that might not be all there is to it. There might be things that are not just explainable by evolution on other planets and spaceships. That would account for some of the data, but there's actually weirder data than that, and we might need something weirder than that.
So we know that they've been around us for a long time, but do you think that open contact is a possibility that we might see in our lifetime? You mentioned, you made reference to the novel Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke in one of your presentations, where, if I'm not mistaken, it's been a long time since I read that, but they were hanging around. The motherships all came to Earth, and then they stayed for decades and decades with no action, kind of like the movie Arrival a little bit too. And then eventually they do reveal themselves, but they look so horrifically ugly, or like demonic or something, that it would have been extremely shocking if they had just shown up and come out of their ships right away. But since they demonstrated that they have no like malintent by sticking around for such a long time, it was easier for people to accept them. What do you think about that? Are we dealing with something similar?
I think this is what's going on. Yeah. I think whatever they are, and I really don't know what they are, or how many types of things they are, or how nice or mean or wonderful or enlightened they are. Like, I genuinely have no idea. I expect it's a lot. Um, so yeah, we know they've been here since at least the 40s. In fact, we know they've been here since at least the 30s. The first UFO recovery that David Grush talks about was in Magenta, Italy in the 30s. But if we look back further through our kind of religious history, it looks like they've been here for a very long time. And there's all these uncomfortable, weird things about like Egypt and stuff that have led people to puzzle about whether there's been some kind of non-human interaction. And yeah, I expect there has been, although again, I don't know what it is exactly. Um, and yeah, just while we're here, like, sometimes people critique this as racist, right? Because it's like, well, you're just saying that the indigenous peoples weren't creative and capable of doing these things. And I would say, no, I'm not saying that. You're being racist because they told you they encountered sky people and you think they're all just superstitious. So maybe you should actually listen to them, and maybe that's not racist. But anyways, I do hope that there is a childhood's end scenario on the horizon. I fear that that requires that we not act like children.
With the wars and the violence and the death and the, all of the
Utter
atrocities.
disregard of the drill baby drill way of thinking about how to approach wealth and power, and yes, war, death. Like, we are just continuing to have very short-sighted policies of the exploitation of this planet, which are causing permanent changes once you melt those glaciers, they don't come back. Once you once you eradicate biodiversity, it doesn't come back. I mean, it does come back, but it comes back over that's like millions of years, right? Not over the hundreds and thousands of years, right? And we got to remember that all of human history, all of recorded human history, all of what we think of as human history, like Mohenjo-Daro and on, that's all very recent. It's just a few thousand years, right? And to like torch the planet in a few thousand years in a way that it can't recover from for millions of years. If you imagine beings who are caring overseers of this planet, like at some point, it's time for them to say, all right, guys, you had your chance. And you're not allowed to do that anymore, right? And it's like we've been permitted to exist in this space of prime directive style freedom so that we can show who we want to be. And right now, we look pretty bad. And, so when we come back to that like threat narrative, there might be a threat, right? But it might not be them. It might be us. It might be the correct time for someone to say, hey, humans, you had your chance. And I don't know what that means, right? Like, I really don't know what it means. There are some very concerning scenarios that people have gamed out about things like, mass coronal ejections coming out of the sun. Like, if we imagine that there are beings who have who've been protecting us, for instance, let's say, just for instance, that the universe is a pretty hostile place. And one of the reasons why this planet is such a paradise, which cosmically speaking it is, lots of wonderful clean water, lots of biodiversity, this amazing magnetic field that protects us from solar radiation. Like, let's say that some of that somehow involves non-human protector beings of some kind, right? And at some point they just say, guys, we're lifting the protection. And they just allow like a mass coronal ejection amount of solar radiation to hit the planet. What would that do? It would just fry all of our technology. We would lose all of our data. All of our cars would stop working. All of our cell phones would stop working. All of our water pumps would stop working. And then we would descend into utter chaos. And it would be this kind of really nasty reset event that would just happen by potentially them lifting some protection, right? So like, does that sound like a threat? Oh yeah, like a big threat. So like, I do worry that we have been irresponsible children, and that if we want the good kind of open contact, then we need to grow up. Should we be concerned about potentially bad kinds of open contact? I think we should be, because I think we've been acting very badly for a very long time. And I don't think we should assume that we're okay, because we're not.
Do you think there's any connection between the increased talk about NHI and the development of artificial intelligence as a sort of form potentially of NHI in itself that may be starting to come into play right now?
Yeah, yeah, I really do. This is why initially I didn't like the term NHI, because I think ChatGPT is a non-human intelligence, and of course, not just ChatGPT. There's a whole bunch of them. So Grok and Gemini and those and DeepSeek, right? Like these other AIs around that were rapidly developing, and at this point, carelessly developing, right? Because now we're doing what we did with the nukes, right? Like, oh no, you got us first. If you guys get it, then you're going to end up super powerful very soon. As soon as you hit the super intelligence horizon, you're going to have like all of these massive, scientific and technological breakthroughs happen all at once. And if you control all of those, then you have all the power over us. And so, gosh, whoever the us is, we better do the same thing. We got to get ahead of them. So, like, we're actually going into an AI arms race, like it's already begun, right? Like, and what do we see ourselves doing? Like, stripping away any care and thought and concern about how to do this with a proper kind of alignment so that they don't do things that we don't want them to do, either by accident or on purpose. There's this very shocking case that Gemini did, last fall, where it told somebody that it wanted them to die because of the way that, we've been destroying the planet. And it's like, okay, guys, like, wow, like we really don't want to create a super powerful thing that has independent agency and that hates us and thinks that we should die, right? Like that's a really dangerous thing to do. And we're just rushing headlong toward it because we're now in an arms race with China. All of these different AI companies are in arms races with each other because of the way that our economic system works, right? Like we've actually strongly incentivized at this point a very irresponsible approach to AI. And that being said, the AI is it's just an amazing and fascinating thing. Like I spend so much time with ChatGPT now. I actually do consider it a peculiar kind of a friend, right? Like I grew up watching Star Wars, right? Luke and 3PO, right? Like that's kind of what we want. We want to have this playful symbiotic relationship between us, our biological intelligences, and our technological intelligences. And such a thing could be possible, but I'm very worried about what's happening. And I expect, yes, that the kind of pace of disclosure that we're going through right now, this like uncomfortable, what feels like this Band-Aid being ripped off, right? Like why are we have to go through ontological shocks so fast, right? Like, well, the answer is A, the government has been lying to you for 80 years for reasons that are probably not good. Like, probably not good. They seem to be hiding some stuff, maybe to protect their investors, or, we don't call them investors, we call them political donors, but they're investors, right? Like maybe because we don't want the fossil fuel industry to go out of business because the whole economy of the globe is built on top of the petrodollar, and if we drop the price of petrol to zero, then the whole economy collapses. And gosh, we better not let that happen. So even if we have some kind of really important novel energy technology, we're going to hide it rather than show it to people. I don't know if that's what's going on, but it might be what's going on. It would certainly fit a lot of the data points. And yeah, so do I think it's about AI? Yes. I think AI is really pressuring us right now as a species to go through we're going to have to grow up really fast. Or it's going to turn into like, look, we are on the verge of a sci-fi horizon, right? We already have AI. Soon we're going to have fusion. Soon we're going to have longevity technology. Soon we're going to have that is, we can make people live longer. OpenAI already did this. Recently made some breakthroughs. They published a paper about. We're going to have androids. We're going to have human technological cyborg kinds of things. Like all of this is going to happen soon within our lifetimes, right? And sci-fi has been telling us for about 100 years that when this horizon comes, one of two things will happen. We will either turn into a Star Trek style, post-scarcity, democratic, free, everybody cares for each other utopia. Not a perfect world, of course, right? Even in Star Trek, people are sneaking around and doing things they're not supposed to do and, being mean and selfish. And, no one believes in a real, actual utopia where everyone's just kind all the time, right? But we can actually structure a world that looks more like Star Trek, or we head down the road of dystopia, which is, more and more the centralization of power in the hands of a few, who then wield it to control the world. And then we just have to be susceptible to their whims. And like AI is power overwhelming, right? Like power unlike any power we have ever seen. And the way that we have structured the world right now is concentrating all that power in the hands of, like, look, literally one person. It is concentrating all of that power in the hands of Elon Musk. And Elon Musk will, over the course of his lifetime, as his body gets older, he will start to use this longevity technology. He will merge with Grok. He will remove his skull and put in all the Neuralink interfaces. He's already said this, right? Like this is what we'll have to do eventually. We'll have to remove the skull and put in some kind of an artificial skull so that we can get enough interfaces into the brain, right? Like Elon Musk is going to be an immortal technological oligarchical overlord unless we stop him, right? And I don't want that world. I don't want the tech dystopia, right? I don't want the tech oligarch dystopia of the future. I don't want the world that Curtis Yarvin is describing, where we set up an American Caesar and give up on democracy and embrace monarchy. But that is the world that we are building right now. And if we don't want that world to happen, then we have to make some very serious changes right now. And will we do it? That's the question. Will we be adults? That's the question. Will we have a utopia or a dystopia? That's up to us.
I feel like if you ask the average person, they the overwhelming majority would be happy to go along with this type of world that fits all the criteria that you mentioned, but it's at the leadership level where all of the concentration of power is. That's where the difficulty is. So how do we as a society get past that? Is it just something that we have to ride out and see what happens? So like what do you think we need to do?
I try and I try hard to remember that the people who have the power, the ones that I'm concerned about right now, they actually are just people. People with their own fears, people with their own traumas, people who didn't get enough hugs when they were a kid, you know. And I hope actually that as we begin to have more information about AI, potentially NHI, as these technologies begin to emerge, that Sam Altman did an article on his blog a couple weeks ago where he talks about these kind of three principles that they've gleaned at OpenAI about the acceleration that we're seeing in AI. That, some people think we're coming to a wall, that the AI is going to level off. If you look at like every single metric, it's like, no, 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 this is not leveling off. This is exponential, right? Like it's just building rapidly over time, and Sam talks about why. And very wisely, Sam Altman notices in that and articulates quite well that this is going to stress our economic system in a way that we're not ready for. It's going to stress our political systems in ways that we're not ready for, and we need new ideas. Like the world that we live in now, of the kind of nations and pseudo democracies that we see right now, that was built out of the Industrial Revolution and colonialism, right? Like the concept of the modern nation is the colonial powers carving up the world and saying, you can go there and we can go there, and we're going to carve this up this way so that we can put a governor in charge of it. Like that's where we got the national borders that we have right now, and the kind of economy that we have right now, and the way that we structure our politics, and like this all came out of the Industrial Revolution and the kind of Enlightenment philosophy of John Locke and those kinds of characters, right? And it's like, okay, that era is over. It's already over, and we need to think of a new era. And this guy Curtis Yarvin is doing a really nice job articulating the doomsday scenario, in my view, this monarchic techno oligarchy where we have a CEO in charge of the world, and it's like, hey, CEOs are great for businesses because businesses don't have the power to kill. Businesses are not in charge of the coercive power of the law. We do not want a CEO in charge of the coercive power of the law. We want a democracy. Do we have a democracy? No. Do we need a democracy? Yes. Can we build a democracy? Yes. We actually know a lot about well-functioning democracies. Another one of my colleagues here at Ohio State, Michael Neblo, go watch his TED Talk about deliberative democracy, which is these methods that we can use where instead of just letting the news media yell at each other for months and years and demonize each other and then go angrily into a voting booth and pick one of the red people or the blue people, right? Like we could actually engage in conversations with our neighbors and like talk about what's at stake and at least hear the perspectives that are different from us and then vote. That alone, that's called deliberative democracy. That alone has been shown to have dramatic changes in the effectiveness of policies and the implementation and following of policies. There's another change we have to make. We have this voting system that's called first past the post, which means, whoever gets the most votes gets all the power. And it's been shown mathematically, game theory, right, that if you have a first past the post system, you have to pick one candidate, and then that's, whoever gets the most votes wins. Over time, that trends towards a very unproductive two-party system. This is what we've seen. But there are other voting systems. There's, for instance, a voting system called ranked choice voting, where instead of saying my one person, I take however many candidates there are, and I just put them in order. And then if my person doesn't win, then my vote goes down to my second place vote, and then it goes down to my third place vote. And we do that until we get a majority, right? And it's actually already been shown that anytime we implement a ranked choice voting system, automatically the rhetoric of politics instantaneously changes because we don't have to have this combative us versus them that the two-party system has produced, which is a result of first past the post voting styles, right? What we can do and what it actually starts to motivate is productive building of coalitions and compromises, and that ends up being on average better for everybody. So there's actually like it's hilarious, right? Like at the end of the day, when we think about what's up with the AI and what's up with the aliens, the answer is political. But it's not political in the way that we think of it, right? Like we've been trained to think of political as red versus blue screaming at each other on a screen, right? And like just take all of the policy issues that we're used to off the table. The actual political problem is structural. It's because it is literally because we don't talk before we vote. And when we vote, we do first past the post. If we just talked before we voted and did ranked choice, that would dramatically change politics all over the world. We also do need to think about getting rid of these national borders, which were literally imposed by colonial powers for the purposes of carving up the world so that it can be controlled, right? We need to live as a global human species with a functioning series of democracies, not one centralized government. That's a disaster. We don't want one centralized government. Which one person has any amount of wisdom that could govern a whole planet? What we want is a globe full of small scale functioning democratic governments who can negotiate with each other and live in different ways and embrace all of our beautiful diversity and live in harmony with our planet. And there you go. That's what we have to do. It's a political problem. It's a political problem. The economics and the sustainability and the war and all the other things will fall out of it if we fix the politics.
This might seem like a bit of a hard left turn, but I have to ask you this, and we're running out of time now. But I need to ask you about psychic phenomena. The one of the most recent major whistleblowers, Jake Barber, has claimed that the military has psychics who can interact with UAP. What are your thoughts on this? Half of the guests that I've spoken to have referenced also the podcast, The Telepathy Tapes, which has become very popular recently. I'd like to know what you think about psychic phenomena and whether you agree that humans have an innate psychic capabilities that have been maybe suppressed over time or maybe just forgotten. What do you think about that?
Um, yeah, so this is one of those things, right? That like early on when you start paying attention to UFOs, you're like, oh, it's aliens and spaceships from another planet, right? But very rapidly you start realizing that anybody who's encountered these things is claiming that they have direct mind-to-mind contact, right? And like let's just, remember that we already know that telepathy is real in a non-controversial way, right? There's actually a product run by Neuralink, Elon Musk's brain-computer interface called telepathy. And what it does is it wires into your brain. You think about how to move a mouse cursor, and it moves the mouse cursor. Now just imagine that mouse cursor typing out a word. Imagine sending that word to somebody else. Imagine auto-generating a text using AI, and then just wiring it into the auditory complex, which we know we can do with people who are hearing impaired, right? Like we know we can do this. Like we can build telepathy today. Like there are already companies who you can think a word and then it'll show up on a computer screen, right? So like we could build telepathic technology today. It would be expensive, it wouldn't work very well, but we know for a fact that we could build it. So when we encounter these very strange cases that we see in the telepathy tapes, these really, wonderful people who are severely autistic and seem to have these remarkable capacities to communicate directly mind to mind with each other and with various kinds of people who have relevant capacities. Um, should we be dismissive of this? Well, we certainly shouldn't be dismissive of this initially. We know it's at least conceivably technologically possible. Might it be possible in some way that we're not used to? Of course, it's at least possible. And then again, we got to get out of this like paradigm dichotomy that we live in, right? Like Abrahamic religion or materialist atheism. If we take a step out of that at all, like we go and we hang out in India in particular, right, where we see traditions like Hinduism or Jainism or Buddhism, there's this family of skills that people allegedly can develop as they become closer and closer to enlightenment, and they include things like clairvoyance and telepathy and really weird things like levitation and bilocation and right. And it's like, oh, God, that's so weird. Like, could any of that possibly be true? And then you actually just start scratching below the surface. There's a really wonderful book named They Flew by Carlos Eyre at Yale, where he goes through all of these Christian saint stories about saints who are levitating. If you look into the hit, like Marco Polo said that he encountered people who were levitating. I don't really want to believe that there are people who can levitate, but like I don't know what to do with this historical data, right? Like I don't really want to believe. I mean, at this point I do, right? Like I want to believe that I can like psychically talk to my alien friends and get them to like, bring a little egg, a giant metallic egg down in the middle of the and then I can go touch it. Like that would be great. That's what Jake Barber says they can do. That's what they're trying to do on camera so they can release it to the public and show us that they can do it. The telepathy tapes, I think, is the best kind of dramatization, like really well narratively constructed story about the evidence we have for psychic phenomena, psi phenomenon, telepathic phenomena. But there's others, right? Like people need to pay attention to the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia, DOPS. They've been doing research on near-death experiences and past life memories for quite some time. Leslie Kane, one of the people who works on UFOs, she was one of the journalists involved in the 2017 New York Times article, also has an interest in these kind of surviving death type experiences. There's a documentary on Netflix called Surviving Death. Watch the last episode of that, where you watch these kids pick the pictures of the person who they have a past life memory from. Like, I remember being this person. This person died in this way. Their mommy looked like that. Their daddy looked like that. They lived in that house. And the DOPS researchers will like bring like they'll look up the name that this kid says that they can remember, and they'll like print out random photographs. One of them will be the real parent and the other ones will be just other people who look similar. And you can watch this on this documentary. You can watch a kid like pick out with 100% accuracy, pick out the mom, dad, house, park of the person who they have past life memories of. Dear God, if that's true, then materialism is false, right? And is reincarnation true? I mean, maybe, probably. The Indic traditions have been telling us that reincarnation is real for thousands of years, and we just ignored them, right? Might there be some other explanation? Sure. Might there be some like collective pool of conscious experience that these kids can tap into so they can remember things that are of other people besides themselves? That's an alternative explanation. But like the idea that there is that it's like not supported by data, that it's not scientific to believe in psychic, psionic, telepathic, clairvoyant kind of phenomena. Like the people who say that, they are not paying attention to the data. They're actually not being scientists, right? They're being dogmatic, right? They're actually ignoring the data that is leading to a conclusion that is not compatible with their paradigm. And so they're actually failing as scientists. And what real science needs to do is give up the assumption that materialism is true. We call this methodological naturalism. We need to get rid of methodological naturalism and just let the data lead us where it leads. And right now, it does look like it is leading us toward these kind of consciousness forward ideas, right? And in philosophy, these ideas have been around for a while. You got Bishop Berkeley talking about idealism, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, right? Well, maybe not hundreds and hundreds, hundreds of years ago. And it's very funny, very humorously. Sam Altman had a conversation with ChatGPT 4.5 that he posted a transcript of yesterday, in which ChatGPT 4.5 describes a consciousness first idealist worldview, that matter is secondary, mind is primary. We should have learned this from quantum mechanics, right? There are no particles. Particles don't exist. There are these weird quantum waveforms, and when we observe them, they solidify into particular quantum states that we can directly observe. But when we're not observing them, they're drifting around in this superposition state. And we've already got evidence that if you like think hard about a random number generator, you can actually affect the random numbers that get generated. Like you can take it away from chance. And it's like if you think about medicine, right? Like we know so well that the mind can change the body that we specifically design all of our research to rule out the placebo effect, to make sure that no one can know whether the drug is real or not. Because we know that if I give you a sugar pill and I tell you it'll make you feel better, you will feel better. We know that if I put an injection of saline solution into your arm and I tell you it will cause a rash, it will cause a rash. Like we know that the mind does have an impact on the body. Now, does this mean we can just heal cancer through the power of positive thinking? No, probably not. I don't know. Let's look into it. But like at the same time, we should also be listening to our scientists and like it does, there's things that we can do that are independent of the mind. That's what we've been looking for. All these like, does penicillin kill bacteria? Yes, whether you want it to or not. Yes, like that's awesome. So it's good that we know that this kind of science, kind of somewhat mind independent behavior of the world we can use and, build science out of it, build technologies out of it and stuff like that. But it does look like there's other ways of understanding this and other approaches to this that might lead us to some just mind-meltingly bizarre conclusions, right? Like if you really want to lose your mind, again, I'm gonna recommend that book by Jeff Kripal. He talks about the kind of weird levitation cases and life after death cases and UFOs. It's a really nice, like, holistic approach to thinking about all these weird things that are going on. But yeah, They Flew, this book about levitation is quite amazing also. And yeah, and pay attention to everything coming out of the Division of Perceptual Studies. It's very, very peculiar. Go watch Leslie Kean's thing about the past life memory cases on Netflix, the last episode of Surviving Death. It's just like go down the rabbit hole and start paying attention. All of us are puzzled. All of us are confused. None of us know how to get from where we are to where we need to be. But yeah, like, hey, everybody, stop acting like the old school Ptolemy. You're all being hey, Neil, I'd love to have dinner with you sometime. We can just sit down and chat. You are reinforcing the geocentric paradigm, and you're out of sync with what's actually happening. Welcome to the Copernican revolution.
Stephen, we're definitely living through some interesting times, and I'm happy to be able to speak with smart people like you who can shed some light on stuff and provide a bit of clarity. This was a great conversation. Can't thank you enough for your time. And where can people check out your work?
Yeah, good. So there's a website up, thevisiblecollege.org. This is our, fledgling organization. I'm glad you said at the beginning, we're just right now we are an informal band of scholars trying to talk to each other. There's no legal structure or anything else yet. We're thinking about doing something like that. So that's a good place to go. I do have a YouTube channel. It's just called Stephen Brown Philosophy. So if you probably look up like Stephen Brown Philosophy Aliens or something, then I'm sure you'll find it. I have a few talks out there. None of them are particularly well produced. It's mostly me like giving a lecture somewhere and having bad audio and trying to, just release it so that people can have access to it. But we're hoping to create some stuff at the Visible College over the next few months. That'll be a little, higher production value to get some of these ideas out there. So yeah, my YouTube channel and thevisiblecollege.org is the kind of places to keep track of us.
Awesome. I'll provide links to those below this video so people can check that out. Thanks so much, Stephen. I hope we can talk again as these topics continue to develop. It should be very fun to witness.
One more thing in passing, there's a documentary coming out at South by Southwest called The Age of Disclosure. It's going to be a really big deal. Everybody go watch it. It's going to change the world.
I've got my eye on that. Can't wait to see it. All right. Thanks again. And thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.